I sat at the dining room table, staring at my phone like it was a ticking time bomb. It had been sitting there, untouched, for the last 20 minutes, the screen still showing Emily's text from earlier that day. She was going to be home late, something about a work dinner that had run long. But I knew that wasn't it. I had known for a while, really. It was the way she'd started pulling away, a slight distance between us that hadn't been there before. Her laugh wasn't as free, and her touch had become almost mechanical, like she was going through the motions. It wasn't the first time one of us had been seeing someone else. We had agreed, after all, that our open relationship allowed for that. But something about this time was different. It felt wrong. And now I knew why. I'd read her messages when she left her phone unlocked on the kitchen counter. It was Ryan. Of all the people in the world, it had to be him. My past, my guilt, my regrets, all the things I'd worked so hard to bury had come crashing back into my life the moment I saw his name on her screen. Ryan, my old best friend, the guy I hadn't spoken to in years, the guy I'd trusted with everything, right up until everything fell apart. And now he was back, slipping into my life through Emily, like some ghost rising from the dead to haunt me. I could still hear Emily's voice from that morning, casual and carefree. "Don't wait up tonight, Max. I might be late." She kissed me on the cheek, and I'd barely registered it, too busy staring into my coffee, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. I wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that we were still okay, that this was just another temporary thing. But I knew better. I tried to remember the last time things had felt normal between us. Maybe 6 months ago? A year? It was hard to pinpoint. We'd always been open, right from the start, and for the most part, it had worked. We had our rules. Always be honest, always communicate, always make sure the other person knew what was happening. It was supposed to make everything easier, to keep us from falling into the traps of jealousy and insecurity. And for a while, it did. But lately, those rules felt like they were made of paper, thin and fragile, barely holding up against the weight of reality. I'd noticed the change in her before this, the way she'd started checking out of conversations, how her smiles seemed to slip away the moment she thought I wasn't looking. I didn't want to admit it, but deep down, I knew what was coming. And now Ryan, of all people. It wasn't just the fact that she was seeing someone else, it was who she was seeing. Someone from my past, someone I'd left behind for a reason. Years ago, Ryan and I had been inseparable, closer than brothers. We had a friend back then, Sarah. She was the glue that held us together, the one who kept us sane when things got too wild. But then Sarah disappeared, one night, just gone. Ryan had been with her that night. He said he didn't know what happened, that she'd left on her own. But I'd never fully believed him. I never got over that night, never stopped wondering what really happened, and it tore Ryan and me apart. And now he was back, with my wife. I stood up from the table, pacing the kitchen, trying to figure out what to do. I wanted to confront her, to scream, to demand to know why she would go to him of all people. But I couldn't. Not yet. Not until I understood why this was happening. The Ryan I knew wasn't the kind of guy to just stumble back into someone's life by accident. There was always a plan with him, always an agenda. I needed to know what his was. The door opened, and Emily walked in, looking as calm and composed as ever. She dropped her purse by the door and gave me a tired smile. "Hey, sorry I'm late. How was your day?" I forced a smile, feeling the weight of the phone in my pocket, the messages between her and Ryan still fresh in my mind. "Fine," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Work was busy, as usual. She nodded and made her way to the fridge, grabbing a bottle of water. "I'm going to head to bed early," she said. "I'm exhausted." I watched her walk down the hall, her footsteps soft on the hardwood floor, and the door to our bedroom clicked shut. I sat back down at the table, my head spinning. I couldn't keep this to myself for long. Sooner or later, I was going to have to confront her. But for now, I needed more. I needed to know how deep this went. I pulled out my phone again, scrolling through her messages, looking for any clue, anything that might tell me how long this had been going on. Weeks? Maybe? Months? It was hard to tell. Ryan was careful, his messages vague but suggestive enough to make it clear what was happening. He'd always been good at that, saying just enough without saying too much. The next day, I called in sick to work, telling myself I needed the time to think. But really, I needed time to act. I spent the day digging into Ryan's life, trying to figure out what he'd been up to since we lost touch. I found his social media accounts, his business website. It was all surprisingly normal. He'd stayed in town, started his own construction company. He seemed successful, well-adjusted. But something didn't sit right with me. Ryan was never the type to settle down, to live a quiet, respectable life. There had to be more to it than that. I scrolled further, finding photos of him with friends, at work, living what looked like a perfectly ordinary life. But then there was a picture that caught my eye. It was taken a few months ago, a candid shot of Ryan at a party, laughing with a group of people I didn't recognize. But in the background, just barely visible, was Emily. She wasn't with Ryan, not in the shot, but she was there, in the same space. That was when I realized this wasn't some random coincidence. They had crossed paths before. This had been building for longer than I'd realized. The more I looked, the more I found. A pattern started to emerge, events they'd both attended, places they'd both been. They had known each other for months, maybe longer, and I had never noticed. My heart raced as I pieced it together. This wasn't just an affair. It was something bigger, something planned. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning with possibilities. Emily slept beside me, her breathing steady and peaceful, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside my head. I wanted to wake her up, to confront her, to make her explain how she could do this. But I couldn't. Not yet. I needed to be sure. Over the next few days, I kept my distance from her, acting as if nothing had changed. I couldn't let her know I was onto her. I needed time to figure out what to do next, to decide how I was going to handle this. The tension between us grew, though neither of us acknowledged it. She seemed more distracted than usual, her phone always nearby, her conversations shorter, more clipped. I could feel the distance widening between us, like we were both standing on opposite sides of a chasm, unable to bridge the gap. One night, after Emily had fallen asleep, I grabbed my laptop and sat in the living room, determined to find out more about Ryan. There had to be something I was missing, some clue that would explain why he'd come back into our lives now, after all these years. I started searching for news articles, anything that might give me insight into what he'd been involved in since we last spoke. That's when I found it. An old article, buried deep in the archives of the local newspaper. It was from the year Sarah disappeared. A brief mention of an investigation, a potential lead that had never gone anywhere. But what caught my attention was the name. Ryan had been questioned by the police at the time, though he was never charged with anything. It was a small detail, barely worth noting, but it sent a chill down my spine. Ryan had lied to me back then. He had known more than he let on about Sarah's disappearance, and now he was back, entangled with Emily. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about the affair anymore. This was about something bigger, something that had been set in motion years ago, and I was right in the middle of it. I stared at the article for what felt like hours, the words blurring together as my mind raced. What was Ryan's endgame? Was this about revenge, control, something else entirely? Whatever it was, I knew I couldn't let him win. Not this time. I closed the laptop and leaned back, staring up at the ceiling. The truth was out there, somewhere, just waiting to be uncovered. And I was going to find it. I just had to figure out how to do it without losing everything in the process. The next morning, I felt like I was walking through a fog. The weight of everything I'd discovered last night hung over me, and every time I glanced at Emily, I felt the tension between us thickening, growing harder to ignore. She was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee and scrolling through her phone, oblivious to the storm that was brewing inside me. Part of me wanted to confront her right then and there, to tell her I knew everything, that I'd found the messages and that Ryan wasn't some harmless fling. But I held back. I wasn't ready for that confrontation yet, not without more answers. "Do you have any plans tonight?" she asked casually, her voice snapping me back to reality. I looked at her, trying to keep my expression neutral. "Nothing major, probably just some work to catch up on. You?" She glanced up from her phone, her eyes flicking to mine for just a moment before she looked away again. "Yeah, same here. Late meeting at work." The lie slid out of her mouth so easily, so smoothly, that if I hadn't known the truth, I might have believed her. I nodded, forcing a smile, pretending to be the same unsuspecting husband I had been a week ago. All right, I'll probably see you later then. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of routine. Shower, breakfast, getting ready for work. All the while, I kept running over the events of the past few days in my head. Ryan had somehow worked his way back into our lives, and Emily had fallen for it. But why? Why now? What did he want? I couldn't shake the feeling that this was about more than just some random affair. Ryan had a plan. He always did. And I was going to figure out what it was before it was too late. By the time I got to the office, my mind was spinning with possibilities. The memory of that article from the night before gnawed at me, that brief mention of Ryan being questioned after Sarah disappeared. He'd never told me about that. In fact, back then, he had acted like he was just as clueless as I was about what had happened to her. But clearly, there was more to the story than he had let on. I needed to find out what really happened that night. The only problem was, I had no idea where to start. I tried to focus on work, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Sarah. Her face, her laugh, the way she used to light up the room with her energy. She'd been our friend, the glue that held our little group together. And then, one night, she was gone. No one ever found out what happened. It was like she had just vanished into thin air. The police had conducted a brief investigation, but without any solid leads, the case had gone cold. For years, I'd tried to put it behind me, to move on from the questions and the guilt. But now, with Ryan back in my life, it felt like all those old wounds were being ripped open again. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I couldn't just sit back and let things play out. If I wanted answers, I was going to have to dig deeper. Maybe I couldn't confront Emily yet, but I could start with Ryan. I needed to know what he was hiding, what his connection to Sarah's disappearance really was, and why he had decided to come back now. That evening, after I was sure Emily was out of the house, probably with Ryan, though I couldn't bring myself to check, I grabbed my keys and headed out. Ryan's business wasn't hard to find. He'd done well for himself, it seemed, running a successful construction company just a few miles from our neighborhood. The building was small but modern, all sleek glass and steel, with a polished sign out front that bore his name. I parked across the street and watched for a while, waiting for him to leave. I didn't have a plan yet, not really, but I needed to see him, to talk to him face to face, to figure out what the hell was going on. After about an hour, I saw him step out of the building, locking the door behind him. He looked just like I remembered, tall, lean, with that same cocky swagger that used to drive me crazy. He hadn't changed at all, at least on the outside, but something was different, something darker. I watched as he got into his car and pulled away from the curb. Without thinking, I started the engine and followed him. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every instinct in me was screaming that this was a bad idea. But I couldn't turn back now. I needed answers. Ryan drove for about 20 minutes before pulling into the parking lot of a bar on the outskirts of town. I parked a few spaces down, watching as he got out of his car and headed inside. I hesitated for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. What was I doing? What did I think I was going to accomplish by following him? But then I remembered the messages, the lies, the way Emily had been slipping away from me, and I knew I couldn't back down. I had to know the truth, no matter how ugly it might be. I got out of the car and walked into the bar, my eyes scanning the dimly lit room until I spotted Ryan sitting at the counter, nursing a drink. He hadn't noticed me yet, so I took a deep breath and made my way over to him. As I approached, he glanced up, his expression unreadable. "Max?" His voice was smooth, casual, like we were old friends catching up after years apart. But there was an edge to it, something that set my nerves on edge. "Didn't expect to see you here." I sat down on the stool next to him, my heart racing. "Yeah, well, I didn't expect to find out you've been seeing my wife." His smile didn't falter, but I could see the amusement in his eyes. "Ah, so you know." "Of course I know. Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" He took a sip of his drink, leaning back in his chair as if he didn't have a care in the world. "I didn't think it would matter. You and Emily have always had an understanding, haven't you?" This isn't the same, and you know it. Ryan chuckled, shaking his head. You're right. It's not the same, but that's not my fault, is it? I clenched my fists, struggling to keep my anger in check. Why now, Ryan? Why come back into my life after all these years? What do you want? He tilted his head, studying me for a moment before answering. You really don't know, do you? I narrowed my eyes, my pulse quickening. Know what? He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. You've been living in a fantasy, Max. All these years, you've been pretending that everything's fine, that you've moved on. But deep down, you know the truth. You know what happened to Sarah. My blood ran cold at the mention of her name. What are you talking about? He smirked, leaning back in his chair again, as if he had all the time in the world. You'll figure it out. You're not as clueless as you think. I stared at him, my mind racing. What the hell was he getting at? What did he know about Sarah? Before I could ask him any more questions, he stood up, tossing some cash onto the counter. I'd love to stay and chat, but I've got plans. He gave me a pointed look, and I knew exactly who those plans involved. Give my regards to Emily. Without another word, he walked out of the bar, leaving me sitting there, seething with anger and confusion. I wanted to go after him, to demand answers, to make him tell me what he knew. But something in his voice, in the way he'd spoken about Sarah, had shaken me to my core. What did he mean? I knew the truth. What truth? My thoughts were spinning, and the more I tried to piece it together, the more tangled it became. I stayed at the bar for a while, nursing a drink of my own, trying to make sense of everything. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that Ryan was right. There was something I wasn't seeing, something I'd buried deep down, along with all the memories of that night when Sarah disappeared. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I needed to find out the truth. Not just about Emily and Ryan, but about Sarah. I couldn't move forward until I did. As I left the bar and got into my car, I knew what my next step had to be. I was going to dig up the past, no matter how painful it was. Because whatever had happened back then, it wasn't over. Not yet. Over the next few days, my life became a balancing act of pretending everything was normal while my mind was spinning with every detail, every possibility of what Ryan had said. His words echoed in my head, haunting me, taunting me. You know the truth. I didn't, though, or at least I didn't think I did. The more I tried to piece it together, the more it felt like my memories of that night with Sarah were missing something, a crucial detail just beyond my reach. Emily, oblivious to my inner turmoil, continued as if nothing had changed. She came and went from the house like clockwork, sometimes with a fleeting kiss, sometimes with barely a word. I had no idea if she was still seeing Ryan, but the distance between us was growing by the day. I hadn't confronted her yet. I was biding my time, waiting for the right moment, trying to gather enough information so that when I did, I would be prepared. But my focus had shifted. As much as the affair with Ryan hurt, I couldn't stop thinking about Sarah. That night had always been a wound I never let fully heal, and now it was festering again. Ryan knew something I didn't. I was sure of it. And if I was going to get any peace, if I was going to confront Emily and move on, I needed to figure out what happened to Sarah first. That night, while Emily was out, I found myself back at the computer, combing through old files, searching for anything that could shed light on the past. The police reports had been vague, the investigation half-hearted at best. Sarah had been classified as a missing person, but since there were no leads, no body, no sign of foul play, the case had gone cold within weeks. But now, with everything Ryan had said, I had to wonder, had something been missed? I pulled up Sarah's social media accounts, ones that had long since been abandoned. The last post she'd made was just hours before she disappeared. It was a picture of the three of us, me, Sarah, and Ryan, at a party, laughing, drinks in hand. It was eerie, looking at that photo now, knowing how everything had fallen apart after that night. The caption was something light, a throwaway comment about friendship. But seeing it now, all I could think about was how that was the last time any of us had been truly happy. I spent hours scrolling through her posts, looking for patterns, clues, anything that could point me in the right direction. Most of it was mundane, selfies, pictures with friends, random updates about her day. But there were a few posts from the weeks leading up to her disappearance that caught my attention. cryptic messages about feeling trapped, about wanting to escape. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. Sarah had always been a bit dramatic, prone to mood swings. But now, with the benefit of hindsight, it seemed like she was trying to tell us something. The more I dug, the more unsettled I became. There were gaps in her timeline, days where she hadn't posted at all, which was unlike her. Sarah had been glued to her phone, always documenting her life. It was as if she had gone off the grid, even before she vanished. I started to wonder if Ryan had something to do with it. Maybe he had been controlling her in some way, manipulating her, just like he was now trying to manipulate Emily. My gut told me I was getting closer to the truth, but I needed more. I decided to go back to the beginning, to that night, the night Sarah disappeared. I hadn't thought about the details in a long time. In fact, I had tried to forget them. But now, I forced myself to remember. It had been a party at some mutual friend's place. We'd all been drinking, laughing, having a good time. Sarah had seemed fine, at least that's what I remembered. But as the night went on, she started acting strange. She was quieter, more withdrawn. I had chalked it up to the alcohol at the time, but now I wasn't so sure. Ryan had been with her when she left the party. That much I knew. He'd told me she wanted to go for a walk, clear her head. I hadn't thought much of it then. Ryan and Sarah had always had a close relationship, almost like siblings. But that night, something had changed. When Ryan came back without her, I'd asked where she'd gone, and he had shrugged, saying she needed some space. I hadn't pushed it. I'd trusted him. That was my first mistake. I replayed that night over and over in my mind, looking for anything I might have missed. But the more I thought about it, the more confused I became. My memories of that night were hazy, clouded by time and alcohol. But one thing stood out, Ryan's calmness. He hadn't been worried about Sarah, not even a little. At the time, I'd taken that as a sign that everything was fine, that she would show up the next day, hungover but safe. But now, in retrospect, his calmness seemed off. Too calm, too collected. Like he knew more than he was letting on. I needed to talk to someone else who had been at the party that night. Someone who might remember more than I did. I racked my brain, trying to recall who else had been there. There was a guy named Mark, an old college friend who had been part of our circle back then. He'd always had a good head on his shoulders, not much of a drinker. If anyone remembered more than I did, it would be him. It didn't take long to track Mark down on social media. We hadn't spoken in years, but I sent him a message, hoping he'd be willing to talk. To my surprise, he responded almost immediately, agreeing to meet up the next day. It seemed like he'd been waiting for someone to bring up that night again, just as I had. The next day, I met Mark at a quiet cafe, my nerves on edge the entire drive over. When I walked in, I spotted him right away. He looked older, more tired than I remembered, but then again, so was I. We exchanged pleasantries, but there was an unspoken tension in the air. We both knew why we were there. So, I began after a few minutes of small talk, I've been thinking about that night. The night Sarah disappeared. Mark's expression darkened, and he nodded slowly. Yeah, I figured that's what this was about. I've thought about it a lot over the years. It never sat right with me. What do you mean? I asked, leaning in. He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. I don't know, man. It was just strange. The way she left, the way Ryan acted afterward. I always felt like there was more to the story, but no one ever wanted to talk about it. Do you remember anything specific? I pressed. Anything that stood out? Mark thought for a moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. Well, I remember Sarah seemed off that night. More than just drunk, you know? Like she was nervous about something. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now, looking back, it feels like she knew something was going to happen. I swallowed hard, my heart racing. What about Ryan? Mark's expression shifted, a flicker of unease crossing his face. He was weird, man. I don't know how else to explain it. Too calm, too collected, like he already knew how things were going to play out. After Sarah left with him, I tried to ask him where she went, but he brushed me off, told me not to worry about it. I nodded, my suspicions deepening. Did you ever tell the police any of this? Mark shook his head. No. I mean, at the time, I didn't think it was important. I figured she'd just taken off, you know? But after a few weeks went by, and she didn't come back. I started to wonder. By then, though, it felt like it was too late to say anything. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. Ryan had been hiding something, even back then. I was sure of it now, but what and why? The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that whatever had happened to Sarah, Ryan had been involved. And now he was back in my life, messing with Emily, trying to manipulate me again. But this time, I wasn't going to let him win. I need to figure out what happened, I said, more to myself than to Mark. I need to talk to Ryan. Mark nodded, his expression somber. Be careful, Max. There's something off about him. Always has been. I thanked Mark for his time, my mind already spinning with my next steps. I had to confront Ryan again, this time with everything I'd learned. I needed to force the truth out of him, whatever it took. But I knew I couldn't go into this unprepared. Ryan was dangerous, more dangerous than I had realized, and if I wasn't careful, he would destroy everything. That night, I lay awake in bed, Emily sleeping beside me, the distance between us more palpable than ever. I knew she was still seeing Ryan. I could feel it in the way she avoided my gaze, in the way she rushed out of the house every chance she got, but I couldn't confront her yet. Not until I had all the pieces. Tomorrow I would confront Ryan. Tomorrow. The next morning, I woke up with a pit in my stomach, knowing what the day had in store. Today, I would confront Ryan. Today, I would demand the truth about Sarah and what he was really doing with Emily. As I got dressed, I glanced at Emily, who was still asleep, her back turned to me. It was strange how different everything felt now, knowing what I knew. I wasn't sure if I could ever look at her the same way again, not after discovering her affair with Ryan. And yet, there was still that part of me that wanted to save our marriage, to find some way to fix what was broken. But first, I needed answers. I left the house before Emily woke up, not wanting to deal with the awkwardness that hung between us like a thick cloud. My heart was racing as I drove to Ryan's office, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't have a plan. Not really. I just knew I needed to see him, to look him in the eye and demand the truth. Whatever happened after that would be up to him. When I arrived, the parking lot was mostly empty, which wasn't surprising given that it was still early. Ryan's car was there, though, parked in its usual spot. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was about to happen, and walked into the building. The receptionist looked up as I entered, her eyebrows raising in surprise. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm here to see Ryan," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. She hesitated for a moment, then picked up the phone and dialed his office. "There's a Max here to see you," she said into the receiver. After a brief pause, she nodded and hung up. "He'll see you now." I made my way down the hall to Ryan's office, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the door, I didn't bother knocking. I pushed it open and stepped inside, my eyes locking on Ryan, who was sitting behind his desk, a smirk already forming on his face. "Max," he said, leaning back in his chair, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" I closed the door behind me, my jaw clenched. "We need to talk." Ryan raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "About what, Emily? Or are we going to talk about Sarah now?" I felt a surge of anger rise up inside me, but I forced it down. I wasn't going to let him get to me. Not this time. "You've been playing games with me, Ryan. With Emily, with my life. I want to know why." Ryan shrugged, that infuriating smirk never leaving his face. "It's not as complicated as you think. Emily and I, we just clicked. It's not my fault if your marriage was already falling apart." "You knew exactly what you were doing," I snapped. "This isn't just about Emily. This is about Sarah. You've been holding something over me for years, haven't you? I want the truth." Ryan leaned forward, his expression hardening. "The truth? You sure you want that, Max? Because the truth might be more than you're ready to handle." "I can handle it," I said through gritted teeth. "Just tell me what really happened to Sarah that night." For a moment, Ryan was silent, his eyes studying me like a predator sizing up its prey. Then, he let out a low chuckle. "You really don't remember, do you? You were there, Max. You were right there with us." My blood ran cold at his words. "What are you talking about?" Ryan stood up, walking around his desk and leaning against the edge of it, crossing his arms. "That night, after the party, you and Sarah had a fight. She wanted to leave, to get away from you, from us. She was tired of the games, tired of being the third wheel in whatever the hell we had going on. She told me she was leaving town, that she never wanted to see either of us again. And you didn't take it well. I shook my head, my mind racing. That's not true. I didn't. You followed her, Ryan continued, his voice calm, almost casual. We both did. You were drunk, angry. You couldn't let her go, not like that. And then, well, things got out of hand. I felt like the ground was slipping out from under me. No, that's not how it happened. I don't remember any of that. Ryan's smirk widened. Of course you don't. You've been blocking it out for years. But I remember, Max. I remember everything. My chest tightened, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. What did I do? Ryan stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. You killed her, Max. You and I, we covered it up, buried the body, made sure no one would ever find out. And you've been living in denial ever since. No, I whispered, shaking my head. No, that's not true. It is, Ryan said, his voice cold. You just don't want to admit it. But deep down, you've always known. That's why you've been so obsessed with finding out what happened to her. You were trying to convince yourself it wasn't your fault. But it was. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. Could it be true? Had I really done that? I searched my memories, trying to find some shred of proof that Ryan was lying, that this was all just another one of his games. But there was nothing. Just a dark, gaping hole where my memories of that night should have been. You're lying, I said, my voice trembling. You're trying to mess with my head. Ryan shrugged again. Believe whatever you want, but it doesn't change the fact that Sarah's gone, and you're the reason why. I felt sick, my stomach twisting into knots. I couldn't believe it. I didn't believe it. But the doubt was there, gnawing at me, growing stronger with every passing second. I need proof, I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. If what you're saying is true, I need proof. Ryan's smirk faded, replaced by something darker, more sinister. Proof? You want proof? Fine, I'll give you proof, but it'll cost you. I narrowed my eyes. What do you mean? Ryan stepped back, his arms crossed over his chest. You let me have Emily. You walk away. Leave us alone. In exchange, I'll tell you where Sarah's buried. I'll even help you dig her up if that's what you want. But that's the deal. Take it or leave it. I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. Was he serious? Was he really offering to trade my wife for the truth about Sarah? It was insane. And yet, a part of me was tempted. A part of me wanted to take the deal, to finally put an end to the mystery that had haunted me for so long. But then, I thought about Emily. She didn't deserve to be a pawn in this sick game. She didn't deserve to be caught between me and Ryan, trapped in the middle of a battle she didn't even know was happening. No, I said, my voice firm. I'm not making any deals with you. Ryan's expression hardened. Then you'll never know the truth. I'll find it on my own, I said, turning to leave. As I reached the door, Ryan's voice stopped me in my tracks. You're making a mistake, Max. You can't handle the truth. You never could. I didn't respond. I just walked out, my mind spinning, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to believe anymore. Was Ryan telling the truth? Had I really been involved in Sarah's death? Or was this just another one of his manipulations, designed to make me doubt myself, to make me question everything I thought I knew? I needed answers, but I wasn't going to get them from Ryan. If I was going to figure out what really happened that night, I needed to start looking in other places. I needed to talk to the police, to dig deeper into the investigation, to find out if there were any leads that had been missed. But first, I had to go home. I had to talk to Emily. I couldn't keep avoiding her, couldn't keep pretending like everything was normal. She deserved to know the truth about Ryan, about what he was really doing, about the lies he was feeding her. And I needed to know if she was still willing to fight for our marriage or if it was already too late. As I drove home, my mind raced with 1,000 different thoughts. The road ahead of me was uncertain, filled with questions I didn't know how to answer. But one thing was clear. I couldn't keep running from the truth. I had to face it, no matter how painful it might be. Because only then could I hope to find peace. Only then could I hope to move on. I drove home in silence, the words Ryan had said still ringing in my ears. The thought that I could have been responsible for Sarah's death made me feel sick to my core, but at the same time, I couldn't trust him. Ryan had always been manipulative, always looking for a way to twist the truth to suit his agenda. Could he have been lying, playing with my memories, making me doubt myself to keep me off balance? I didn't know what to believe anymore. When I pulled into the driveway, Emily's car was already there. My stomach twisted as I sat there for a moment, staring at the house. I had to talk to her. There was no more avoiding it. I needed to confront her about Ryan, about the lies, and about where we stood. But as I reached for the door handle, I hesitated. What if she already knew everything? What if she had been in on it from the start, playing her part in Ryan's game? I pushed the thought aside. No, I couldn't start thinking like that. Emily wasn't Ryan. She had her flaws, but she wasn't cruel. She wouldn't have done this to me on purpose. Whatever she felt for him, whatever had drawn her into this affair, it had to be more complicated than I could understand from the outside. I stepped out of the car and headed toward the front door, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I walked inside, the house was quiet. Too quiet. I found Emily sitting on the couch, staring down at her phone. She didn't even look up when I entered. "Emily," I said, my voice sounding more strained than I intended. She glanced up, her eyes wide with surprise, as if she hadn't expected me to be home so early. "Max, I didn't hear you come in." I stood there for a moment, just looking at her, unsure of how to begin. There was so much I wanted to say, so many questions swirling in my mind, but none of them felt right. Finally, I just said it. "We need to talk." Her expression faltered, and she set her phone down on the coffee table. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I know about Ryan." There it was. The words were out, hanging between us like a ticking bomb. Emily's face went pale, and she looked down at her hands, avoiding my gaze. I didn't mean for you to find out like this," she said quietly. "How else was I supposed to find out?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, though I could feel the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "You weren't going to tell me, were you?" She shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "I was going to. I didn't know how. I didn't want to hurt you." "Well, it's a little late for that," I snapped. The words came out harsher than I intended, and I immediately regretted it. But I couldn't help it. I was hurt. I was angry. And I needed answers. Emily wiped at her eyes, her voice trembling. "I never meant for this to happen, Max. I swear. It started out innocent. I didn't even know it was Ryan at first. We just started talking at this event, and before I knew it, things had gone too far." She shook her head, her voice cracking. "He didn't tell me his last name at first. He didn't need to. I didn't even realize who he was until later, and by then, I was already, I don't know. I was confused, and I didn't know how to stop." I sat down across from her, my heart pounding in my chest. "Why him, Emily? Why Ryan?" She shook her head, her voice filled with regret. "I don't know. I really don't. It wasn't like I was looking for this. It just happened. I'm sorry, Max. I really am." Her words felt hollow, like they weren't enough to explain everything that had been happening. "This isn't just about the affair, Emily. Ryan's not who you think he is." She looked up at me, confusion clouding her eyes. "What do you mean?" I hesitated, unsure of how much to tell her. How could I explain everything Ryan had said about Sarah, about my role in her disappearance, without sounding completely insane? But I had to try. She deserved to know the truth, or at least what I believed to be the truth. "I talked to Ryan," I said slowly. "He's been lying to you. He's been lying to both of us." Her brows furrowed in confusion. "What are you talking about?" I took a deep breath. "Do you remember Sarah?" Emily blinked, caught off guard by the sudden mention of a name from our past. "Sarah? Of course I do. She disappeared years ago." I nodded. "Ryan was with her that night. He told me something that doesn't make any sense. He claims that I was there too, that I'm the one who—" I stopped, unable to say it out loud. My throat tightened and the words got stuck. Emily's eyes widened in shock. "Wait, what? What are you saying?" I forced myself to continue. "Ryan said that I'm the one who killed her, that I was too drunk to remember, but we buried her together, covered it all up." For a moment, the room was silent, Emily staring at me in stunned disbelief. Then she shook her head violently. "No, that can't be true. Max, you didn't do anything like that." "I don't know, Emily. I don't remember that night clearly. I don't remember a lot of things from back then." My voice cracked as I spoke, the weight of doubt pressing down on me. But what if he's right? What if I've been lying to myself this whole time? Emily stood up, crossing the room to stand in front of me. She grabbed my hands, her touch warm but trembling. Max, listen to me. Ryan is trying to mess with your head. He's manipulating you. He's always been like that, even back in college. You can't believe anything he says. I looked up at her, my heart aching with a mixture of relief and confusion. But what if he's telling the truth? What if I really did something terrible and just forgot? She shook her head again, her grip tightening on my hands. No, I don't believe that for a second. You've never been that person, Max. You're not capable of something like that. Her words felt like a lifeline, something solid to hold on to in the storm of doubt that had been raging inside me. But even as I clung to her reassurances, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than either of us understood. I need to find out what happened to Sarah, I said quietly. I can't just let this go. Emily nodded, her eyes filled with determination. Then we'll find out, together. I blinked, surprised by her sudden resolve. Together? She nodded again. Yes, I made a mistake with Ryan. I know that. But I'm not going to let him destroy us, Max. If he's lying, if he's trying to tear us apart, then we need to stop him. We need to find out the truth, and we'll do it together. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe we could get through this. Maybe our marriage wasn't as broken as I had feared. But that hope was fragile, and I knew it wouldn't last unless we found the answers we were both looking for. We'll start with the police, I said. There has to be something in their old files, something we missed back then. Emily nodded, determination etched across her face. Okay, let's do it. The next day, we went to the police station together. It felt strange, walking through those doors again after so many years. The last time I had been here was when I reported Sarah missing. Back then, the officers had been sympathetic, but ultimately powerless. Without any evidence of foul play, there hadn't been much they could do. But now, armed with Ryan's confession, if you could even call it that, I hoped we might get somewhere. We sat down with a detective, an older man with graying hair and a weary expression. I explained the situation, carefully leaving out the part about Ryan's accusations against me. I wasn't ready to go down that rabbit hole just yet. The detective listened patiently, taking notes as I spoke. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, studying me for a long moment before speaking. Mr. Monroe, I understand this is difficult, but without any new evidence, there's not much we can do. The case went cold years ago. I know, I said, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. But what if there was evidence back then that you missed? What if someone was involved in Sarah's disappearance, and we just didn't see it at the time? The detective sighed, rubbing his temples. Look, I'll take another look at the file, but I have to be honest with you. We're not likely to find anything new after all this time.